Welcome to Spirit Level, the podcast that explores spirit, mystery, inspiration, and the ancient art of divination through the lens of modern living. I'm Jamie.
And I'm Fiongal.
And we're your hosts. In this podcast, we have a mix of guest speakers asking what spirituality means to them, talking heads between Fiongal and me, our experiences, what's helped us along our paths, and what could inspire you, and maybe some meditations along the way.
Welcome to this, the first episode of Spirit Level. I'm Fiongal.
And I'm Jamie.
As we said in the introduction, but just in case you missed it. And yes, we're super excited about this. Just to give you a little bit of an overview of what we're hoping to achieve with this podcast. Well, personally for me, it's really about having a platform to share all the things that I've discovered on my spiritual journey, the things that I found inspiring, really helpful. And obviously, there's a lot of misconceptions, particularly around the world of psychism, spirituality, tarot, all of that stuff. So trying to debunk and perhaps demystify some of that. Just as a kind of very brief overview, and I'll be talking about this in more detail for sure. I work as a tarot reader, psychic, and spiritual advisor. So I do a lot of kind of one-to-one sittings, a lot of workshops, events, retreats, teachings, that kind of thing. So just talking a little bit of the things that come up for a lot of my clients, things that I notice in the collective, and things like that. So what are you kind of hoping to get out of this, Jamie? Why have you decided to do this podcast?
Decided. I feel like I was just coerced into this slightly.
Like the rest of our marriage.
You wanted to do a podcast and I was dragged along. No, I mean, look, it's going to give us an opportunity to have a bit of fun with this stuff. I think the running a business has its challenges. It can be quite overwhelming. And actually just sitting and chatting about what we do, getting guests on to chat about their life, and how they see spirituality, I think is just going to be really interesting for us, and hopefully interesting for the listeners.
Yeah, really beautifully said. Yeah, because we're both hugely creative as well as spiritual, so hopefully this is going to be a kind of bit of a creative outlet, and just see how it goes, see how it naturally unfolds, really.
Good. So we're going to start with asking Fiongal some questions today about his spiritual journey and how he became to be the owner of the Wellness Foundry, the founder of the company, and kind of just a little bit more about his journey. So I'm going to jump straight in and ask you the question: why did you end up on this spiritual journey? Was there a particular moment, a particular trigger, or something that happened that kind of set you off on this path?
Where to begin? So I will kind of go back to actually when I was a kid, but I've only understood this retrospectively. I didn't actually understand it at the time. But when I was a kid, when I was about maybe between 8 and 10, something like that, I used to lie on my bed and try and astral project. It's basically I would lie there and kind of effectively leave my body. For those that don't know what astral projection is, it's when your kind of energetic body leaves your physical body. And this is something that I would just, of a Friday evening, lights out, and I would just try and kind of float out of my body. And no one taught me about that. Both my parents are quite bohemian, but they're not necessarily spiritual or kind of what we'd classically call spiritual. I don't know where I picked this up from. It's just something that I used to, and I was incredibly sensitive as a kid as well. One of my big bugbears is people going, "Oh, don't be so sensitive." "Oh, why are you so sensitive?" Because it's a little bit like saying to somebody, "Oh, don't be so creative. Why are you creative?" So I was enormously creative and sensitive as a kid. And I think very, very easily from a very early age could identify when people were lying or just had a real kind of sixth sense about things. And it was really discombobulating for me because I would have that sense and then be told something else. So my intuition, I think, was very, very heightened, very strong from a very early age. And my background, as some of you may have guessed by my name, is Irish. So obviously, I recently discovered as well that I think my great-grandmother was a tea leaf reader or a medium of sorts.
What's even crazier is you've never been to Ireland.
I've never been to... I know.
We have to
it's
go.
Outrageous. Absolutely outrageous. So that was kind of my kind of initial part of it. And again, when I was about 13, 14, I became quite... obsessed with Wiccan as well. And I remember building an altar in my bedroom and my family were like, what's that? I was like, oh, it's an art project.
What do you mean by Wiccan, just for people that might not know?
It's a kind of pagan. So a lot of kind of working with the land, what we would typically call a green witch.
Right.
So working, I had little tinctures with herbs in it, and I used to kind of cast spells and all of this stuff.
I didn't know this.
Yeah.
Oh,
and that
goodness.
kind of went on for a couple of years. But again, because there was no outlet for it, or I remember going to a bookstore as well, Waterstones, and kind of picking up the books on green witchery and stuff. And again, my friend at the time and I remember distinctly going to his house again probably on a Friday night, and both of us trying to levitate. So this is just, I don't know where all of this came from. It was obviously just something completely inherent. But because that wasn't supported, or I didn't have the resource, or I didn't really know where to go, that very much fell by the wayside. So from probably about 16 onwards, up until I would say 26, so a good 10 years off. And as is kind of typical for these journeys, if you don't start leaning into your spiritual side and your intuitive side, the universe just goes, smacks you over the head with it, really. So it's interesting because it was round my Saturn return. So for those that are kind of unfamiliar with the concept, Saturn takes about 28 to 31 years to orbit the sun. So within that time, it comes back to the place that you were born. And Saturn is the planet that very much governs karma, our karmic debt. So very often between these particular times, every 28 to 31 years, we go through these cycles of really reevaluating our lives, and things that have laid dormant become very pressing, and our viewpoint, or the things that we value, let's say, change. So actually, I was studying, so I have a background in fashion.
Yep.
And I was studying at the Royal College of Art doing my master's. And sorry, this is a bit of a segue, but it's important. My mum used to keep rabbits. So she lives in France, and she has not really a farmstead, but she has a small holding with animals. And as part of that, she used to have rabbits. And she had them, they're very, very well kept and looked after, but she had them in quite spacious cages. And I remember distinctly one night going to sleep, and I hadn't spoken to my mum very much over that period just because I was so busy with study. I remember going to sleep and having a vivid dream that mum and I were sitting on a park bench, and I had a rabbit in a cage on my lap. And my mum said, "Oh, you can let that rabbit out. You can let it run around. It's not stressed, so it won't try and bolt. It will just kind of hop around." So kind of slightly reluctantly, I opened the cage and set this rabbit down. And then as soon as I did, it started burrowing underground. Oh, goodness sake. So I started chasing after it and digging a tunnel after it. And the ceiling kept collapsing, and I'd have to pack it up. And this white rabbit was just getting further and further away. And then I heard my mum's voice at the other end of the tunnel saying, no, stop chasing it. You're just going to scare it away. You're never going to catch up with it. Come outside. We're going to talk very kind of casually, very gently, and then the rabbit will reappear. And I woke up with this absolute knowing that I have to contact my mum. I have to contact my mum and say, have you checked on your rabbits? Because something is going on. And the rabbits were a big part of her livelihood at that point as well. She tanned the skins and sold the meat. And I just woke up and I messaged her and said, don't think me mad, but are all your rabbits okay? And she messaged back saying, so bizarre, they've all escaped. And I said, when did this happen? And she said, last night.
Wow.
And that was just, again, a bit of a standalone moment. I thought, oh, that's a bit odd. And I think even my sister at the time saw that message that was happening between the both of us and said, oh, have we got a psychic in the family? ? Ha, 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 ha.
Little did they know.
Little
what
did
was
they
to become.
know. So, yeah, I kind of, again, put that on a shelf, didn't really think much of it. But during that time, I was a practicing Buddhist. I was a practicing Buddhist for about 8 years. No longer quite as involved. I still hold on to a lot of the philosophies, but not a regular practicing Buddhist anymore. But in amongst that time, I was having very, very strong experiences in my meditation. So the rooms would kind of turn upside down. Again, it really harked back to that time when I was astral projecting as a kid and kind of floating out of my... I'd have these really, really intense experiences. So that happened. And then thirdly, it really did come in threes. It was this kind of trinity of experiences. And perhaps most kind of pronounced, and this was particularly the thing that kind of tipped me over the edge, shall we say. I was working in fashion, as I mentioned, and I have a tendency, I don't know if you know this, to push myself a little hard.
Mm-hmm.
I don't always find it easy to pull back and relax. It's not really in my emotional repertoire. So at that time, I was really pushing myself. And, you know, fashion is an amazing industry, but it is notoriously tough. You finish one collection and you're straight onto the other. There's not much reprieve. And around that time, I just kept fainting. I would be in the middle of the studio and I would faint. I would be walking down the street and I would faint. I'd be on the train, I would faint.
Right.
And it kept going on. And I eventually went to, a little bit graphic, but one night I was so violently sick. It was just awful. I've never been sick like that. And in the morning, still didn't feel quite right. So went to the walk-in A&E and spoke to the lady on the desk. And she said, I was looking for A&E for the walk-in centre and I couldn't find it. So I went into A&E and I said, where's the walk-in centre? And she said, why? What's going on? Explained all the symptoms. And she went, no, you need to be here in emergency. And at that very point, I planked it, which was actually a bit of a blessing because they immediately came out with a...
Got seen quicker,
quite. I don't recommend it as a technique, but it did help. So I got rushed into A&E and I was kept there for 5 days and they ran every test possible. They ran ECG, they ran brain tests, they just looked at absolutely everything. And they were saying, you're fine, there's nothing going on, this shouldn't be happening. And I remember going back to the meditation, having those experiences in meditation. I was going to the meditation teachers and saying, what's this? What's going on? And they said, we don't know, this shouldn't be happening. So it was just this increasing thing where I was having more and more intense sensations and experiences, but no one could kind of identify them or put a kind of framework to them. So again, with that episode in the hospital, I slightly kind of put it to one side and thought, okay, maybe it was a blip. And then was on a Buddhist retreat and again, meditating, eating really well, no stress, and it happened again. And there was honestly nothing more jarring than going from a silent Buddhist retreat back into A&E.
Right.
And when I went back into A&E, it was the circus. It was just nuts. There was a man being arrested. There was a woman dressed head to toe in red with this kind of dyed red hair, this big beehive red hair. There was this woman that was really, really unwell, this frail old lady that was kind of desperately trying to get attention of the doctors. And the whole thing was just surreal, being flung from one kind of environment to the other. And then I went back to the Buddhist retreat and I was just like, I can't do this anymore. I can't live like this anymore. I'm just getting increasingly more frustrated. And thankfully, somebody on the Buddhist retreat that was leading it pulled me aside and said, look, if you have tried conventional medicine, why don't you look at acupuncture? My partner is an acupuncturist. You should go and see her. And I did. And it was, the first inkling of somebody really listening to my history and not looking confused. And being introduced to the concept of energy and all of that stuff, but in a very, very grounded and practical way. And at around that time, I also did my Reiki. Well, I went to see a Reiki healer, the amazing Sushma, who works from the Karmari. Check her out if you're unfamiliar with her. She's incredible. And I went to see her. She gave me a healing, and again, really piqued my interest. So I did my Reiki 1, and then so I got attuned into Reiki. And then the day after, I was sitting in a cafe, and I was writing in my journal, and I started scribbling all of these messages. I didn't know where it was coming from. They were really specific. They were basically communicating with someone, something, and all of these kind of channeled messages started coming through. So again, I went back to people and said, what are these experiences? And everyone was like, I don't know, that shouldn't really be happening. So it's like the third time in a row that I thought, and all amongst this time, I just thought, am I going mad? Right. Is this what's going on? Am I just becoming unhinged?
Yeah.
Because no one could seem to identify or offer any kind of condolence. People were very empathetic and compassionate, and thankfully no one ridiculed my experiences, but no one could actually say, yes, okay, it might be this. And that was a whole process of about maybe 2 to 3 years. So that took a long time. That wasn't an immediate thing. And then I don't know how it happened. I really don't know how it happened. Something obviously intervened. But I remember walking into the College of Psychic Studies, which is an amazing, amazing building in South Kensington. It's been there since, I think, 1896 or something. Don't quote me if I'm wrong on that. But it's been there for over 100 years. And
it's like Hogwarts.
It is like Hogwarts.
Very magical.
Absolutely Hogwarts. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who wrote Sherlock Holmes, obviously used to be one of the presidents there. So it's got this amazing history. And I remember walking in there and asking about the courses, and ended up meeting my mentor, Gary Wright. And when I went into his class, it was like somebody could then give me the language, the understanding, the context, and the framework to all my experiences.
Right.
So this is what really frustrates me about people kind of boo-booing or making fun, poking fun at psychic and spiritual. It's sometimes seen as a kind of, silly you for believing in that. And actually, for me, it might sound a bit like hyperbole, but it did save my life. I think had I not had that education or that support, I would still be reeling in this place of what is happening, what is going on. And so looking back retrospectively, a lot of what was going on was just me having a psychic and spiritual awakening.
Yeah.
And a lot of that was compounded by the fact I was incredibly ungrounded. And we'll probably talk about grounding in further detail at another time. But just not being present, not being in my body, not being kind of grounded in my experiences, really. So it took a lot of work. Again, it took maybe 2-3 years worth of work. It wasn't an immediate, kind of waving a magic wand, excuse the pun, kind of solution to it. And this, again, is a thing that a lot of people overlook of spiritual and psychic processes. The good psychics, the people that are able to really hold space, and those that are in their field as mentors, as gurus, as kind of spiritual leaders, you have to do the work. There is no, and this is what's been so enriching and challenging of the spiritual journey, is that it's forced me to examine shadow aspects of myself, parts of myself that I haven't always integrated or been comfortable with or celebrated or enjoyed. So it's by no means just a kind of, again, this real common misconception that those that are spiritual are somehow less involved in the world.
Right.
We hope you're enjoying this episode of Spirit Level, brought to you by the Wellness Foundry, bringing spirit to soul. Looking for a trusted and industry-leading place for spiritual wellness? Then the Wellness Foundry is for you. Listed in Time Out and Evening Standard as one of the best wellness hubs in London, they offer one-to-one tarot psychic readings, energy healings, luxury retreats, mystic teachings, and a range of beautiful products to clients all over the world, all with a down-to-earth, accessible, and non-dogmatic approach centered around balancing mind, body, and soul. Use code PODCAST5 at checkout and enjoy 5% off your first booking with us. For more information and bookings, visit the website wellnessfoundry.co.uk or find us on Instagram at Wellness Foundry. Terms and conditions apply.
We keep using this word spiritual. So for listeners that think, am I spiritual? What is spirituality? Like, could you summarize what spirituality means to you, perhaps?
Yeah. Great question. In a way, it's kind of really simple, and in a way, it's really complicated. But I think that is the nature of spirituality in general, really. For me, being spiritual is being in tune with the soul. There's a slight difference between the soul and spirit. So the soul, I think the best description I've ever heard of the soul is it's like the thumbprint of God. It's every single thumbprint is individual, but it's all part of God, the universe, higher power, whatever you want to call it. But then that is influenced by wants, karma, predilections, characteristics, and that becomes the spirit. But it is the kind of, in part, the purest part of ourselves. But really, you are a spiritual person if you're asking the questions, why am I here and what's my purpose?
Right.
Those are soul questions.
Right.
And as soon as you start looking at that, as soon as you start looking away from the ego, the id, and what can I get, and start looking at kind of what can I give, I think that is the start of a spiritual kind of journey.
Like a life of service. We talk about that, don't we, in spirituality? I always think it's a life of service. As a yoga teacher, you are always giving. You're trying to teach people things, but you're giving them this space. It's not about you really when you're teaching. It's about what they're taking from it. So it's a life of service to others, right? Would that be correct? Is that how you would see it? Yeah.
Absolutely. And it's also this thing of you do have mind, body, emotions, and soul. So it's, again, there's this common misconception of, if you're spiritual, that's, you're just involved in that. It's just about kind of woo-woo, crystals and hemp, it's all of that. And actually, no, I think a truly kind of spiritual life, you understand more and more and more how these things interplay with one another. It actually makes you understand more of who you are and more of the world rather than less than. It's not a retreat from the world as sometimes it can be seen as, and some spiritualists behave in that particular way. But no, it's just understanding also in part that what happens in the one happens in the whole. So again, that's a very kind of spiritual idea, is I am part of a whole. My actions have consequences, and one is not isolated from the other, so to speak. But yeah, I think in its kind of simplest terms, that's kind of how I place it.
And then going forward a little, so you had your kind of spiritual awakening. What happened then? Did you leave the world of fashion and dive into the tarot, or what was that journey like to where you are today? So like filling in those gaps a little bit.
Again, it was a really confusing time for me. It was one of the kind of big ironies was the Royal College of Art, where I did my MA that I mentioned before, and the College of Psychic Studies are just around the corner from one another.
Funny.
And I remember one time walking, I can't remember, I was walking, it was a really interesting time because I also remember leaving the college. I would study there every week, and then I'd go straight from there to Mitra Studies, which is like Bible study, basically, but for Buddhists. And I remember going from one to the other and just being really confused. I was having an identity crisis. I was thinking, am I a fashion designer? Am I a spiritualist? Am I a Buddhist? Am I all three? Is one kind of in battle with the other? So it was it's only over the last kind of couple of years has that kind of settled and integrated and resolved within me. But yeah, I continued to work in fashion. So I actually started studying, I think I can't quite remember if I studied before because I moved to China. I did a stint in China for a while, working for a fashion brand over there. I think it's when I came back. Yes, that's correct. When I came back, I did my yoga teacher training in India. And then it kind of evolved into...
yeah, because I remember when I met you, it's interesting how you would present yourself. Or when I first met you, you always eased in with, I'm a yoga teacher, which most people can take, right? So I distinctively remember that was how you kind of started. And you went from, I'm a yoga teacher. And as we got to know each other during the evening a little bit more, eventually
this was on our first date.
On our first date, the truth started to come out. And what's funny is I've noticed a shift in how you now describe yourself to people back then and how you do now, because you always led with that, because it was this this confidence in yourself to actually be, well, actually, no, I'm not a yoga teacher, I'm a psychic. And it's been really lovely watching that progression of how you've really stepped in and owned that power of, you're a great yoga teacher, but it was never really your calling. It was part and parcel of all of this and got you on your journey. But you're much more you when you're in the archetype of a psychic.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, because it's funny. I've had to come out twice in my life. One as a gay man, and secondly as a spiritualist.
Yeah.
And in many ways, I think coming out as a psychic spiritualist was
harder.
Might have been harder in some ways. Thankfully, and particularly around those times that I was really kind of having these very, very intense experiences, some of which I'll probably go into at a later date because it got really weird. Particularly, it got really odd, even for me. I love the world of the weird and wonderful, but at times it got really intense for me. And both my parents worked in mental health. And I'm deeply fascinated between this link between kind of psychic awakening and spiritual awakening and mental health. So a lot of times I did think, oh, am I going mad? But thankfully, I was in an environment where people were supportive and they didn't ridicule it and they were kind of curious. But I can only imagine, time and time again, I've had to kind of counsel and coach people through that coming out of the spiritual closet. Because it is really terrifying. And again, this is why we want to do this podcast, is to really and thankfully, it is going that way.
It is, for sure.
When we started, who would have believed that we would have worked with Dior and Chanel and all of these great brands?
Well, what about the other week? We did an event for a load of ambassadors. I mean, sending a psychic to an ambassador, UK ambassador gathering. It's like, it's there everywhere.
Yes.
And actually what we're trying to do now is normalize it, right? Totally. Because we are pretty normal. I mean, I'm a bit more normal.
You're a bit more normal.
I'm a bit more grounded, but we're both grounded. We're both very much in this world, and I think this is what we're trying to demystify, isn't it? Is that to be spiritual, to be psychic, I always put somebody on a platform. I always put on a pedestal that if somebody was psychic, they were of another being. They were another land. They were magical. They were this, they were that. And of course, we are all magical in our own ways. But I really, truly believe that we all have this ability to be psychic.
Completely.
Right? And I just want us to, over the coming weeks and months, to demystify some of that stuff and actually let people listen to us and think, oh, they kind of sound normal. Maybe I am a bit spiritual.
And I was saying the other night, I was at a party and there was a guy who, really nice guy, worked in investment banking or kind of, serious job. And I told him what I did. And he said, oh, actually, I've got a story. And almost everybody, when I say I'm a tarot reader and psychic, even the most staunch empiricist, those that just don't believe in this stuff at all have a story. Something that they can't explain, something that's kind of above and beyond their normal experiences. And that, this is what psychic is. Again, we can often think of psychic as end of the pier, draped in purple velvet, kind of slightly naff stuff. But actually, what we mean by psychic senses is just anything that is outside of our physical five senses that helps us understand the nature of things.
Yeah.
So always the example I give is like when you walk into a room, two people aren't necessarily speaking, but they've just had an argument. You can feel
Right, what's that saying? You can
cut the air with a knife or something, or cut the tension with a knife.
Exactly.
That is your psychic sense.
Exactly.
That is you knowing something beyond just
what you can see
what
or hear.
You can see, hear. Yeah, exactly. Exactly that.
Because if we were to talk just briefly a little bit about terms of being psychic, they're called clairs, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we're quite different in terms of mine.
Clairs are for the people listening. Clair comes from the French word clair, which means clear. So it's clear hearing, clear smelling, clear tasting. So it's being able to see, know, feel, or sense something clearly and truly. Basically, sorry.
No. Thank you. That's absolutely right, and it's everybody has a slightly different clair that they are more perhaps drawn to or use more often. It can be several of them, but maybe just explain what your strongest clair is.
Yeah. So to kind of give a practical example, it's like my sister, for instance, has an amazing sense of smell. She's got an incredible olfactory capacity, and I don't. My sense of smell is a bit tough, but actually my vision's quite strong, for instance. But because I'm very, very creative, one of my strongest clairs is clairvoyance. So this is often a term that people have heard, but can often use incorrectly.
Yeah.
Say, oh, I went to see a clairvoyant. They might have done, but not all psychics are clairvoyants, because one word that I really love and really identify with is a seer. But again, it's not kind of, it's a bit provocative or evocative. Sometimes that word, sometimes people don't fully understand it. But if I could really kind of lean into a title, I would probably call myself a seer and a modern mystic, because that is particularly within my readings, I often receive images, symbols. And this is one thing important thing about going to see a reader is that we're always trying to translate energy into language, and that isn't a perfect transmutation.
Yes.
That isn't, that is quite reductive and quite gross. So again, that's why when I'm giving readings, to give a symbol or an analogy is very rich, because it points towards something without kind of, again, making it reductive.
But that's how it's shown to you, right? That's how it works for you. But it doesn't have to be like that for everybody, does it? So for example, with myself, I think would I be clair-knowing? Is that the term?
Claircognizance.
Claircognizance or clair-knowing is how I remember it. And that's where I don't necessarily have crazy images. I do see images and I do see scenes and pictures, but sometimes it's just a knowing. It's just when I'm tuned in and open, which we can talk about how we open up through our chakras as well. But it just comes in, and it comes in a way that I don't know where it comes from. I just know, and I know it's not from me, which is harder in a way, because it's why I've always doubted myself, because people that are clair-knowing, I think, almost find it easier. So because you find it easier, you think, I can't be doing this.
Completely.
And I know our tutor has always said he's also that similar energy field. And he said to me, we struggle the most because it's almost too easy that you start doubting yourself.
There are pluses and minuses to all of them, for sure. Because as a seer, you're completely right. I get these visions, I get these images, and I know they're not from me. So that's quite easy to identify. But then sometimes translating that or putting those in practical terms is much more difficult than when you're kind of just channeling things. But just to go back to kind of, because we were talking about that transition for me from moving from kind of fashion to this weird and wonderful world of the Wellness Foundry. So I'd set up the Wellness Foundry, and we'll talk more about that in detail probably later, but I set it up in September of 2018, I believe. So I originally, after the kind of, I think actually just before I went to the college, actually, I started a tarot course with an amazing woman called Tiffany Crisara, gorgeous, gorgeous, gorgeous woman. And I did a 6-month course with her, really in depth, really full on. And again, it was much more about looking at you rather than learning the cards. For instance, the cards were a vehicle to self-discovery. I really liked that approach, and it's an approach that I've taken on when I teach the tarot, very much so. So I started with the tarot, and the tarot for me, I respond really well with it because it is so visual and it is all on symbology. So I started there, and I started just reading for people, mainly friends, and then I kind of read for members of the public. I remember I put a thing on Gumtree and all of that stuff. And then bizarrely, I was doing some part-time work in fashion still. It was quite an acute shift because I left this job in China, and it's going to sound like I'm bragging here at the moment, but there is a point to it. And I was being paid about £130,000 a year. So a big sum of money. Good wage. It was nice. And then I started up the Wellness Foundry and doing this part-time work, and then I dropped to about
0.
Yeah, basically. Close to. It was 17,000 a year. And in London, that was, I remember going to bed stressing, how am I going to pay rent? Yeah. It was awful. But again, this is really part of the rite of passage that I had to go through. And again, I see it time and time and time again with my clients, of them knowing that they want to go in a different lane, knowing that they want to take a different path, but say, I can't because of the money, because of the finances, I'm tied up with this. And it just becomes a golden cage. And there is, please trust me that it will work out. It was blooming tough. Yeah. It was horrid.
What's the saying? Leap and the net will appear.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, I had to fall quite a long time before it appeared.
The net was quite far down.
It's quite far down. But it did appear. And I'm so thankful that I made that jump. So I carried on with the Wellness Foundry and my fashion work kind of simultaneously. And then I gave in my notice to my last job.
Oh, just tell people a little bit about what you were doing. There's some funny moments in this as well.
Just to clarify, by this point, when I got this other part-time job, I was on slightly more money than 17,000. I don't want anyone to think ill of the company. They paid me very well and very properly, but it started growing again. But I used to work as an ecclesiastical tailor, so I used to measure vicars and priests for their cassocks and the kind of the black robes that they would wear. And it was a little company, well, not so little, but a company that again had been around forever and a day. Used to get members of the clergy come in, and I would measure them up. It was so funny actually, because I was like, I can't tell them I'm a tarot reader. I think I'll set on fire in the middle of the workshop. But I that richness of kind of iconography and religious iconography has always fascinated me. So it was in many ways the perfect job. I did love it, but I knew that I wanted to. I remember I get in trouble, but I get work phone calls whilst I was tailoring. I'd have to run out the back. They have this little back corridor, and I'd take these kind of work calls at the same time. So I was trying to juggle all of these things, and then I gave in my notice to this job because I knew that I wanted to work on as a tarot reader and psychic full time. Gave in my notice, and then the last day that I had was a week before lockdown, and there was something so aligned. The universe really was just looking after me, because I think had I left that till later, it would have been so jarring and I wouldn't have been ready, and I felt like I was trying to play catch up. So I was working on it full time right in the beginning of lockdown. And again, on paper, that would seem like it's never going to work, right? How are you going to start a new business right at the beginning of lockdown? No one's seeing. but it just exploded.
Well, it was the right type of business to be starting, wasn't it? For a start, we didn't have a physical space, which I think the challenges of people that had physical spaces, that was the big problem. But we were in wellness. We were there to try and catch some of these people that were losing jobs, that were being made to stay in a country that they didn't want to be in, or move to a place. Some people going home to their families because they thought they had to. And I think it was just the timing actually was the catalyst that just took the Wellness Foundry to the next level.
Absolutely. And because when we just started as well, we were doing kind of meditations, live meditations on Instagram for people, and
jiggling the room around. Remember that? I was living in Tooting at the time, and we were not long been together, had we? It was like all my flatmates had moved out, so we like turned the one back kind of living room into our studio space, and we just jumped on that bandwagon so quickly. It was like, right, let's get filming, let's get recording, and it's actually really fun.
It was. I know it wasn't for everybody. I know it was an incredibly tough time, but I think because we'd just met, we were just throwing ourselves into this new kind of venture. We just really just had to make it work, get it working. Yeah, it was actually really just a kind of blessing, thankfully. So then, then just kind of threw myself into it wholeheartedly. And one of the interesting things is, because I've got this fashion background as well, it's enabled me to bring a certain degree of aestheticism to the brand. And even more bizarrely, particularly at the beginning, but still now, all of the big collaborations we've ever done is with major fashion brands. And that's not through my fashion connections. It was never something that I looked for. No. They all came to me. So again,
that just shows, doesn't it, how things work in terms of it being aligned and what you're putting out, and the look that you have. And I think that was always the thing with the Wellness Foundry. I wasn't as involved in it at the beginning. I was still on my journey of yoga and teaching full-time yoga, but I always saw the Wellness Foundry as, because of your look and how you presented, I always saw it as a modern day spiritual hub. And there wasn't anything like that around, so to speak. So I always had this clear idea, because of you and what you brought to it, that's where it would go. So it just made sense that energetically, that's what we were drawing in, right?
Absolutely.
That has been fascinating for me, hearing some things that I didn't know. And this is going to be weird, actually, that we might start discovering things about. I've just realized we may well discover things about each other that we don't know, because when do you get to sit down and just chat like this?
Totally.
You just don't. So this is going to be fun, I think.
Yeah, really exciting.
So I hope everyone listening has enjoyed what we've talked about today, and have perhaps something they can take away from it, something that's sparked some intrigue, perhaps. And we very much enjoyed doing this, and we look forward to our next sit down.
Yeah, well, we'll be diving deep into your story.
Yeah, good.
You'll be in the hot seat next time.
Oh, I know. Well, thanks for sharing and being so vulnerable and telling us your story. It's been super interesting. And until next time, see you then.
Bye. And that's the end of this week's episode. We'd love to hear what you think, or suggestions on what you would like us to cover for the future. Either leave us a comment if the platform you're listening to allows it, or drop us an email, hello@wellnessfoundry.co.uk, or a DM on Instagram. Be sure to hit subscribe or follow to stay up to date with the latest releases. But until next time, love and blessings.
We hope you've enjoyed this episode of Spirit Level, brought to you by the Wellness Foundry, the home of spiritual wellness. For more information and bookings, visit the website wellnessfoundry.co.uk or find us on Instagram @Wellness Foundry. Don't forget, as a thank you for listening, receive 5% off your first booking by using code PODCAST5 at checkout. Terms and conditions apply.